So the second classic study we come to is Craik and Tulving, 1975. And this study makes a very simple point, which is the fact that elaboration during encoding benefits later retrieval. Now that's a fairly simple idea. The more you work with material, the better you'll remember it later. But they had some experimental evidence for that. And their experiment gave sentences like you will see on the slide, one of which is longer and requires more elaboration, and the other of which is shorter and requires less elaboration. So you can read those sentences now and solve them, i.e. give a word at the end that completes the sentence in a meaningful way. And then what we would test you on later is that word that you generated. And we'd find that for the longer, more complex sentence where you had to elaborate more, your memory would be better. This just illustrates the point that elaboration during encoding, the more you think about it, the more you work with the material, the better your memory will be later. I'm going to discuss now ways in which these ideas about encoding, storage and retrieval might be useful to students in learning situations, and this is one application of this research work. So let's start with elaboration. You don't need to be a genius to work out the more you elaborate with material, the better you'll retain it later. Of course, this is a main goal of education. All your coursework and all the worksheets that you do are about solving problems. And the idea is that in solving problems, you learn about how to solve problems, but you also retain the information that you've worked with much better than if you're not solving problems and if you're not working with the material. The second considers cues and context. We can take points 2 and 3 together. So Godden and Baddeley with the divers suggest that there's a powerful effect of context on our retrieval. Now let's say you want to do well in an exam, and therefore you want to match the state of encoding with the state of retrieval. Well, in fact, you'll probably do your revising in your bedroom, but you can't sit your exam in the bedroom. You have to sit it in the sports hall or wherever you sit your exams. So that's a problem. And in fact, we find that those kinds of contexts, environmental contexts, don't show such a powerful effect after all. But what is a more powerful concept and what is a better thing to think about is the effect of cues. So cues you can make for yourself. So in revising, if you have a list of things you want to remember, you can make a cue which is elaborated, which is based on the materials that you're trying to remember and connected with it, but that when you see that cue, relatively automatically, the answer comes to mind. So let's say you wanted to remember the name of a famous psychologist such as Thorndike. You might start imagining in your mind a rose, because rose goes well with thorn, and that way you could use rose as a cue to retrieve Thorndike, which is a relatively difficult thing to retrieve on its own. My final point refers to a very modern idea in student education, the idea of desirable difficulties. One of the things we've learned from memory research is the more difficult it is to process things and the more you have to work with the materials, the better your memory is eventually. If you think about recognition, recognition is actually a rather easy thing to perform. So if you think about a multiple choice test, students tend to like multiple choice tests because they find them relatively easy, because it's recognition they're doing and not recall. But the recognition can seduce you into thinking you know things when in fact you don't know things. So in a revision situation, if you test yourself by recognition, you'll be overestimating how much you know, because the recognition will come easier, but it would be much more difficult to recall the information, to reproduce it from nothing. The idea of desirable difficulties is related to this idea. What we're trying to do as educators is make things difficult for students to do in order to enhance their learning experience. And one of the reasons why this is interesting is because students might not like it. They might say, that teacher makes things difficult, or why is this material so difficult? Why am I struggling with this? And the idea is that that is ultimately better for your retention of the material than if we make it a very easy thing for you to do with lots of recognition tasks, for instance. Finally, we come to how important these kinds of ideas about cues and the match between encoding and retrieval, how important they are for us now. And throughout this podcast, I've been wearing this device here, which is a SenseCam. And SenseCam is an experimental device developed by Microsoft Research at Cambridge. And we've been doing some research with this device. Essentially, it's a digital camera with a fisheye lens which takes photos according to sensors within it. So it takes a photo every 2 or 3 minutes. What we find in the context of our research is that when you represent people with these films of their life, it acts as a very powerful cue to their memory. So we can give these to people with memory impairment in order to help them kind of work in daily life and to have an intact memory again. And you might be thinking, well, how does that link to what's gone before in the drier experimental work? The idea is this. I've told you about how important cues and context are in memory, but they're in very dry laboratory settings. Imagine how cool it would be if you went through life and you could always jog your memory by giving a powerful visual cue. And that's what this device does for you. You review your day as a series of images all stitched together as a film, and you can show one here. I've uploaded one as part of this podcast. And the idea is that looking at this is helping you retrieve memories by taking you back to the instances of your encoding. So to summarize, successful memory function relies on encoding, storage and retrieval, and each one of these needs to be intact for you to have the experience of retrieving something that you learned earlier. In human memory, there's a crude division between recall and recognition, and this is one of the ways in which we explore memory impairment and so on. Recall is enhanced by many factors, including context and elaboration, and it's these two factors that I've considered in the experiments described here today. So finally, you might like to think about how these things apply to your own student learning and how you can take them forward in everyday life. You might like to think about how they apply to psychology in terms of models of human memory and how memory is impaired, but you should be able to find, even if you're not that interested in cognitive psychology, that these are important concepts. If you're reading a book and trying to revise, close the book and practice recall rather than just blankly recognizing the information that you're reading. Try and think about the times in which you're using recognition and recall and see how that goes for your studying and whether you can actually shift from doing recognition maybe to doing more recall.